Hello, I'm speaking to you from a familiar place to many of you. This is the pulpit of St. Martin's Church, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite parts of the church service because it's what I get to do a lot of, which is preaching sermons. I want to tell you a little bit about what a sermon is, and then I'm going to tell you why we do it when we do it in the church service. So, a sermon is basically just a speech that connects one or more topics and connects to a text. So it started out as a form of teaching in the church that allowed the priest to help people understand the scripture that they could not read. And there were more than one type. So you had sermons which were preached by a clergy person, typically in the early church, somebody who was ordained by the church to do that. And they were often the only person in the church who could read and knew about the scriptures. And you also, as time went by and more people could read, like during the Protestant Reformation, would have books of sermons that were called homilies. And if you didn't have a clergy person, someone, like maybe someone in your family, would stand up and read a homily to give you some story or some information about what the church teaching was on a particular topic. So there were homilies, and those were read by lay people. And there were sermons, and those were preached by clergy people. We still have that distinction about homilies and sermons, but now what it usually means is that a homily is shorter. Clergy people still usually preach the sermon in a church, and that's because we are educated and called to help people understand the scripture. And we have a specific reason for doing that. The reason I am called to preach is that I feel like it's important for people to know who Jesus is, and to know how the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus impact their lives. So that's a major factor in the type of preaching that I do, which is usually without notes and a little bit more about how the scripture relates to your daily life. There are lots of different kinds of sermons, and all of them are good topics, good reasons for preaching. Some people preach a lot on theology. Some people preach a lot on history. Some people preach a lot to help people understand the plain meaning of the scripture, but mostly what I'm doing when I preach is trying to connect the stories in the gospel and the stories in the Old Testament to the people that are listening so that they can live their lives now. So that's how I preach sermons. Why do we have sermons where we have them? Well, we have two things about that. The first is, why do we preach from this? This is called a pulpit. It is a very ancient space for preaching sermons, and it's part of the tradition of the church to elevate the preacher above the congregation like this. It's not because the preacher is better than the people in the congregation. It's mainly for acoustics. It's easier to hear if the person is above you and projecting their voice out over the congregation. Most churches didn't have microphones like we have in this pulpit. They had big pulpits, sometimes with a canopy over them, to help the voice of the preacher be heard above the other people in the room. So that's why pulpits tend to be higher than the congregation. In our church, we have a pulpit, and we have a lectern where the scripture is read from, usually by lay people, and they're about the same height. The reason that they're about the same height is because our church is a church that came after the Protestant Reformation, where we started to believe, and still do, that lay people have as much to share about the gospel as the clergy do. So even though I preach the formal sermon because I'm called and educated to do that, you and your families are called to talk about the gospel, are called to read the scriptures, and to share with other people about your faith. So in that way, you are preaching as well. So we preach from the pulpit because it's easier to be heard in the pulpit. So when I preach from the pulpit, I can put my book here, I can read the gospel from here if I want to, and I can give more complicated exposition about the scripture by writing it down. Usually, I don't preach that way. Usually I preach without notes because I like my connected speech to be connected to you. So we preach from the pulpit because it's easier for people to see and hear if we're here. We read from the lectern also because it's easy for people to see and hear from that place. So when you come to church, that's why people are up here elevated over the congregation. We also preach at this point in the room because we are at an in-between place. We're at the in-between place between the proclamation that happens out here of the gospel and the Eucharist, or the Holy Communion, that happens in the chancel behind me. We are at a point in the service, if you notice, between the reading of the gospel and when the congregation stands up and says the Nicene Creed. The reason that the sermon comes at that point in the worship service or the liturgy is that we, as preachers, are meant to take what you heard in the gospel and the scriptures and help you to experience it in your heart, to be convicted about what you should do, and to feel a stronger sense of your faith. So we do all this reading, then I do some preaching, and then we all stand up and affirm our faith and trust in the words of the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed, because our response to hearing the gospel should always be a stronger affirmation of our faith. So that's why we preach when we do. We preach to get you from where you are out there listening to the sacramental life of the church, and then out into the world where you will do your preaching and your teaching. And yes, even children can preach and teach about Jesus. All you have to do is remember what you know about Jesus, why you love him, and share it with others. You don't have to have a fancy degree. You don't have to know all the biblical languages. You don't have to know anything other than you are a beloved child of God, and share that with other people. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you on Sunday for the sermon.